Eliza looked at Thomas, truly looked at him and saw a stranger. She saw the flash of anger and the iron certainty of his expectation, and she knew that the predictability she had craved was just a polished name for total subjugation. Her heart, which had been frozen solid for months, suddenly thawed and began to pound with violent, desperate life. Ben's music reached its crescendo, a moment of pure, screaming intensity that asked the question one final time. Choose. The scent of the perfect white roses, the suffocating lace, the judgmental silence of the town. It all faded. All that mattered was the raw, beautiful sound of the piano. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the air stinging her lungs, and finally, she knew what she had to do. It was terrifying, shameful, and utterly right. She turned her head toward her father, who was watching her with an expression of pure, dawning horror. Her mother, in the front pew, let out a small, strangled gasp. The entire church was a statue garden, frozen in anticipation. With a speed that surprised everyone, especially herself, Eliza pulled off the diamond engagement ring that Thomas had placed on her finger and let it drop onto the polished marble floor. The sound was surprisingly small, a tiny clink that nonetheless echoed like a gunshot in the silent, packed sanctuary. The sound cut through Ben's music, which immediately stopped, leaving an abrupt, stunning vacuum of noise. Thomas looked down at the ring, his face a mask of disbelief, then back up at Eliza, his anger now mixed with public mortification. "Eliza, what are you doing?" he hissed, his voice cracking. She didn't answer him. She simply lifted the veil from her face, exposing the stark reality of her decision to the town. She looked at her father, whose face was etched with a lifetime of disappointment, and she spoke, her voice clear and carrying, though trembling slightly. "I can't, Daddy. I just can't." The moment stretched out, agonizing and eternal. The silence that followed was a physical entity, heavy enough to suffocate. Pastor John, the master of the booming voice, was utterly speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Thomas, abandoning all pretense of composure, made a move to grab her arm, but Eliza stepped back quickly, putting the altar between them. The entire congregation erupted into a confused, shocked buzz, whispers like 1,000 angry hornets. Eliza, focusing only on the distant, silent figure of Ben, slowly, deliberately, began to walk. She wasn't running. She was marching. Her white dress, once a symbol of purity and perfection, now felt like the banner of a rebellious army. She walked past the empty pews, past her weeping mother, past the stunned bridesmaids, her eyes fixed on the only man in the room who understood the language of her heart. When she reached the piano, Ben didn't move. He simply stared up at her, his eyes asking the final, terrifying question. "Are you sure?" Eliza reached out, her hand shaking violently, and placed it on Ben's shoulder. The contact was brief, but the warmth of his body felt like coming home after a long, cold exile. That simple touch confirmed everything. She looked back at the altar, where Thomas was still rooted in shock and disbelief, and at her father, who had sunk onto the steps of the chancel, his monumental figure suddenly reduced by sorrow. The path she was choosing meant pain, scandal, and profound, public shame for the people she loved. But the alternative meant a daily death of her own spirit. She gave Ben a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Ben stood up, knocking the heavy piano bench back with a loud thud. He didn't speak to Eliza. He didn't look at the congregation. He simply took her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers, and together, they walked. They didn't use the main aisle. They walked the short distance to the side door, the small, unnoticed exit usually used by the janitor and the maintenance crew. As they walked, the whispers and shouts of the crowd intensified, reaching a fever pitch. A few people rushed forward, Thomas's brother, the head usher, but the shock and swiftness of the action kept them frozen long enough. Ben opened the heavy side door, and the cool autumn air hit Eliza's face, a sudden, glorious relief. She could hear her mother calling her name, a desperate, wailing sound that sliced through the chaos. But she didn't stop. She stepped out of the sanctuary, out of the life that had been prescribed for her, and into the harsh, beautiful uncertainty of the outside world. They didn't speak until they were clear of the church property, running across the manicured lawn and onto the unpaved road. The silence was broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the frantic rustling of Eliza's heavy silk gown. They ran, a bizarre sight, the pristine, high-society bride and the piano man in his dark, slightly rumpled suit, fleeing toward the river. Ben didn't need directions. The blue ribbon was their lighthouse. When they reached the ancient oak, its leaves a riot of late autumn gold and crimson, the small, bright ribbon tied to the lowest branch fluttered like a signal flag. They stopped beneath its sprawling branches, leaning against the rough bark, both exhausted and exhilarated. Eliza's breath hitched. "Where will we go?" she finally asked, the question huge and terrifying. Ben pulled her close, his arms wrapping around the silk that suddenly felt like simple cloth. "Anywhere, Eliza," he whispered into her veil. "Anywhere but back there." The immediate, urgent problem was the dress. It was too conspicuous, too white, a beacon of scandal. Ben pulled a worn, canvas duffel bag from behind the oak tree, a bag he had prepared the night before, a final act of reckless hope. Inside were simple things: a pair of old jeans, a plain shirt, and a thick, serviceable denim jacket. Eliza ducked behind the tree, her fingers fumbling with the tiny, pearly buttons of the gown that now felt like a despised prison uniform. She shed the silk, the crinolines, and the heavy lace like a snake shedding its skin. When she emerged, transformed into simple denim and cotton, she felt lighter than air. The heavy white dress lay in a crumpled heap at the base of the oak, a discarded monument to a life unlived. Ben looked at her, truly seeing the woman he loved for the first time without the layers of expectation. He didn't say she was beautiful. He said, "You look like you, Eliza." It was the highest compliment he could offer. The small, discreet car Ben had borrowed from his friend, a practical, dust-colored sedan, was parked a quarter-mile down the road. They climbed in, Ben fumbling the key into the ignition, his hands still trembling slightly from the audacity of their escape. As they drove away, they could see the church in the distance, a sudden flurry of activity, cars pulling out, people standing on the steps pointing in their direction. The news would spread like wildfire through Harmony Creek. The shame would be enormous, but for the first time, Eliza felt an intense, defiant joy. They drove south, away from the familiar roads, away from the life they had been born into. The radio was silent, the only sound the hum of the tires on the asphalt. Ben reached out and placed his hand on her knee. "I still can't believe you did it," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You chose me." Eliza leaned her head against the cool window glass. "I didn't choose you, Ben," she corrected, a soft smile finally touching her lips. "I chose the music, and the music was always you." The day was a blur of highway signs and cheap diner coffee. They talked, not about the past, which was too painful to dissect, but about the sudden, terrifying blank page of their future. Ben had a small savings account, enough for a few months of uncertainty. He spoke of playing piano in a bigger city, of teaching music, of building a life based on something other than a well-tended reputation. Eliza listened, feeling the slow, deliberate unknotting of the tension that had gripped her for months. She told him about the dreams, about the ring dropping with the sound of a gunshot, about the cold fear of Thomas's control. It was the first time she had been entirely honest with anyone, including herself. The conflicts of their life had been traded for the conflicts of their freedom, the fear of poverty, the anxiety of anonymity, and the difficult task of building a relationship from the ashes of a public scandal. But these new fears felt manageable because they were faced together. Back in Harmony Creek, the aftermath was a disaster. Pastor John, initially devastated, was now furiously determined to manage the PR nightmare. He addressed the congregation that evening, his voice heavy with sorrow, framing Eliza's actions as a moment of temporary, nervous confusion, a breakdown brought on by the stress of wedding planning. Thomas was furious, his public humiliation a wound he couldn't hide. He demanded the return of all the gifts and declared that Ben, the pianist, was nothing more than a thief who had preyed on a fragile woman. The town was irrevocably split, one half gossiping about the scandal, the other half siding with the heartbroken pastor and the wronged groom. The story immediately morphed into a local folktale, whispered on front porches and over church socials, gaining layers of drama and invention with every telling. The simple truth, a woman choosing love over duty, was too plain for them. They needed a villain, and Ben, the brooding artist, was easily cast in the role. Ben and Eliza finally stopped for the night in a small, nameless town far enough away that their story wouldn't precede them. They found a tiny, dusty motel room with thin walls and a buzzing neon sign. It wasn't the honeymoon suite planned by Eliza's mother. It was a sanctuary of their own making. The exhaustion of the day finally caught up to them. As Eliza lay in the strange bed, Ben sat on the edge, pulling the blue velvet ribbon from his pocket, the one he had tied to the oak. He gave it to her. "This is your blue, Eliza," he said softly. "The one they wanted you to wear for luck. But you don't need luck now. You just need courage." She took the ribbon, clutching it tightly, and finally allowed herself to weep. Not from sorrow, but from the draining release of months of tightly held emotion. They were starting over, stripped of everything familiar, but with the quiet, profound knowledge that they were finally, authentically themselves. The next morning they made a pact. They would not hide, but they would change their path. They drove until they hit a small, bustling city further south, a place where no one knew Pastor John or Thomas, and where a person could disappear into the crowd and find work. Ben found a job almost immediately, not as a church organist, but playing jazz piano in a dimly lit club. A job that was messy, creative, and suited his spirit perfectly. Eliza, shedding the mantle of the pastor's daughter, found work in a small flower shop. It was hard, anonymous labor, but she loved the smell of the damp earth and the vivid colors of the blooms, a stark contrast to the sterile white roses of her planned wedding. Their new life was precarious, their rented apartment small, but it was filled with the easy laughter and true conversation that had been missing from her gilded cage. The challenge of their new reality was the realization that love wasn't a finished melody. It was a daily composition. They argued about money, about the lingering shadow of Harmony Creek, and about Ben's late hours at the club. The grand, dramatic romance of their escape had to settle into the domestic, sometimes mundane, grind of real life. One night, after a particularly tense argument over a broken lamp, Eliza felt a surge of doubt. Had she ruined her father's life for this, for a slightly shabby apartment and a difficult, uncertain future? Ben saw the doubt in her eyes. He walked over to the small, rickety table, picked up a pen and a napkin, and began to sketch a melody, their melody, the whistle tune. "We bought this with the price of a scandal, Eliza," he said, not harshly, but with firm honesty. "We don't get to take it back. We have to make it good. That's the duty now. Our only duty is to make this work." His words were a mirror, showing her that courage was needed not just for escape, but for the commitment that followed. Eliza decided she needed to make peace, not with the town, but with herself and her father. She sat down in the quiet anonymity of the flower shop during her lunch break and wrote a long, difficult letter to Pastor John. She didn't apologize for leaving Thomas. She apologized for the pain and public humiliation she had caused the family. She explained that she had needed to choose her soul over her reputation, and that the marriage would have been a sin against truth. She didn't ask for forgiveness, only for understanding. She sealed the envelope and dropped it in a mailbox hundreds of miles away, the act a small, necessary cleansing of her conscience. She knew she would likely never see her parents or her hometown again, but the letter was a final, honest sermon, preached only to the man who needed to hear it most. Thomas, meanwhile, tried to reclaim his dignity. He publicly announced that the marriage had been called off due to unforeseen mental instability, and was attempting to sue Ben for damages, though he knew it was a hollow threat. The town, tired of the scandal, eventually moved on, though Eliza and Ben's story remained a fixed, cautionary folktale. Thomas married 6 months later, a plain, quiet woman chosen for her total lack of independent spirit. He built the sunroom as planned, but it was a cold, quiet place. He achieved the perfect stability he desired, but it was utterly joyless. The irony was not lost on the few who remembered the way Eliza had looked that Sunday, the single moment where pure, reckless passion had trumped decades of rigid propriety. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. It was thick, sealed with the church's official embossed stamp. Eliza's hands shook as she opened it. The writing was her father's familiar, heavy script. He didn't forgive her, not in the simple way she might have hoped. Instead, he wrote only one sentence, followed by a postscript. The life you left was built on stones. The life you seek must be built on honesty. P.S. The recessional piece was, technically, the most beautiful music played in that sanctuary in 20 years. Don't waste it. It wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledgement. It was the pastor speaking as a father, admitting the music had been true. Eliza wept, but this time, the tears were those of acceptance and relief. Their first Christmas together, they couldn't afford a tree. Instead, Ben pinned a single branch of pine, cut from the city park, to the wall and decorated it with shiny bottle caps and scraps of colored paper. It was ugly, makeshift, and the most honest, beautiful thing Eliza had ever seen. They exchanged simple gifts. Ben gave Eliza a set of blank sheet music paper. Eliza gave Ben a new set of ivory keys she had saved up for, keys that still smelled faintly of the flower shop. They sat on their cramped sofa, listening to Ben play a new melody he was working on, a piece that was complex and soaring, filled with all the difficulty and joy of their new, hard-won life. The white dress and the church scandal were distant memories, footnotes in a much larger, messy, and vibrant story. 5 years passed. Ben was offered a gig touring with a small but respected band, a chance to see the country and make real money. Eliza was terrified of the separation, but she pushed him to go. She knew that to hold him back would be to recreate the cage she had escaped. She stayed behind, managing the flower shop, now her own, and sending him letters filled with the sights and smells of the city. Their love had settled into a deep, unwavering companionship, forged in the heat of a public crisis. Their story was no longer about a choice made in a moment of panic. It was about the daily, quiet choice to remain true to that one explosive moment of truth. One hot August afternoon, a car pulled up to Eliza's flower shop. It was not her father, but her mother. She looked older, smaller, and less formidable than Eliza remembered. She stepped out of the car, dressed in a simple cotton dress, no fancy hat, and walked into the shop. The reunion was quiet and awkward, filled with the ghosts of the past. Her mother didn't mention Thomas or the wedding, only asked about Ben. She looked around the busy, colorful shop, the antithesis of the whitewashed life she had planned for her daughter, and a small, slow smile touched her lips. "It smells alive in here, Eliza," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. Before her mother left, she reached into her large, practical purse and pulled out a small, heavy box. "It's not the engagement ring," she whispered. "That went back to Thomas's family. This belonged to my mother. She wore it when she married my father. He was a traveling carpenter, no land, no prospects. But he made her laugh every single day." Inside the box was a simple, beaten gold band, warm with age and history. "He said happiness wasn't a choice of stability, but a choice of companion," her mother said, her eyes suddenly wet. "He never did fit into the church, but he made her life good." It was the final, full circle of understanding. Eliza held the ring, realizing that her mother, too, had a hidden heart that valued the true note over the proper hymn. Ben returned from his tour 6 months later, tired but successful. He and Eliza stood by the river where they used to skip rocks, the old oak tree still standing sentinel over the memory of the blue ribbon. Ben pulled out a new ring, not a diamond, but a simple, dark band of iron, forged by a local artist. Felt heavy and honest in her hand. "Marry me, Eliza," he said, not with a question, but a quiet certainty. "Not in a church, not in white, but in a life that is ours." They married quietly on a Thursday afternoon at the city courthouse, wearing their comfortable, everyday clothes. There were no guests, no pomp, and no music, except for the little, insistent melody that Ben whistled as they signed the papers, the tune about skipping rocks and running free. They built their life piece by piece, a sturdy, beautiful, slightly chaotic structure built on the foundation of a shared secret and a grand public catastrophe. Their story, the one the town still whispers on quiet Sunday mornings, remains a testament to the power of a single, reckless moment. The Sunday she wore white, when a woman chose the song in her heart over the duty in her hand, and traded a perfectly planned wedding for a perfectly honest life.